Hi, this video is going to help you remember the key events of the early period of Weimar Germany from 1918 to 1923. These events are long-term causes or key background to the rise of Adolf Hitler and him becoming Chancellor in 1933. The big debate you're going to have to solve in this period is what was the biggest problem for Germany. There's lots of information to cover and it's quite complicated, so I'm going to make it nice and simple. All you need to do is remember one word, Weimar, W-E-I-M-A-R. Each letter of Weimar will help you remember another word or a simple phrase which will help you remember the key information. So let's get started. W, Weimar voting system. E, economy is a mess. I, international problems. The Treaty of Versailles makes Germans irate. M, murders. A, armed rebellions. And R, the Ruhr crisis. The first problem for Germany was W, the Weimar Constitution. In 1918, the country was in chaos. They were losing World War I, and so the king, the Kaiser, abdicated, and they had to decide how to run the country. The left-wing socialist members of the government declared the country would be run as a republic, and then the Reichstag, led by Socialist Chancellor Ebert, began discussions of the laws about how the country would be run, or the Constitution. One of their biggest decisions was about the voting system for electing politicians to the Reichstag. They chose a very fair system called proportional representation, or PR. Proportional representation means whatever percentage of votes a party got in an election, that party will get the same proportion of seats in the Reichstag or Parliament. So for example, this graph shows one party here got 44% of the votes, and so they would get 44% of the politicians in the Parliament. Very, very fair. At the same time, this party in orange got 12% of the votes in the election across the whole country, and so therefore they get 12% of the politicians or seats in the Reichstag. That system's very different to the system we have in Britain and America, where each local area holds an election and only the politician who wins the election in that local area gets to go to the Parliament. So in this example here, the Blue Party's politicians won the most votes in 52% of the areas where they held elections. So that party gets 52% of the seats in the Parliament, even though they only won 44% of the votes across the whole country. On the other hand, 12% of people across the whole country voted for the Orange Party, but Orange Party politicians only managed to win the most votes in 2% of the areas, which means they get 2% of the seats in the Parliament. In the UK-US system, many smaller parties really struggle to get any politicians elected, so lots of people who vote don't have anyone represent them in Parliament. This is unfair because the biggest party here, the Blue Party, get 52% of the seats, even though fewer people, only 44%, actually voted for them. But it does mean the biggest party often ends up with a majority, in this case 52%, which means that the government can then make decisions even if all the other parties vote against them, which means the government can get on with running the country. In the proportional representation system which Germany chose to use, it was really hard for any party to win a majority of the votes. Lots and lots of different parties got elected to the Reichstag, and therefore the politicians spent a lot of their time arguing and not being able to make decisions. Another weakness of the Weimar Constitution, or the laws they set up to run the country, was that it included an article, Article 48, which said that the Chancellor could take power and make decisions without the Parliament undemocratically if there was a crisis. The problem with the Constitution is it didn't really say what a crisis was. And because of the proportional representation and all the different parties arguing in this early period, a lot of the Chancellors did use Article 48 to get things done. That's not necessarily a weakness, but you've got to bear in mind that many years later, Hitler uses this same Article 48 to seize power and to run Germany without democratic control. This can all seem very complicated, so all you really need to remember is our first letter of Weimar, W. The Weimar voting system meant that many parties got elected to the Reichstag, and so governments were often coalitions of different parties who argued too much. Our next letter of Weimar is E, the economy. The economy is a mess. Germany is bankrupt from World War I. If you look at this map here, you'll see one of the reasons Britain won World War I was because it blockaded Germany's ports. Germany could not get food or coal or gas or any of the materials they needed imported. So if you look at this image, Germany, by the end of the war, people are on bread stamps. They are starving. And people began melting down pots and pans to provide metal for the factories to try and produce weapons. This graph shows that Germany's industrial production dropped massively in World War I, and all this needed to be rebuilt after the war. On top of that, Germany also borrowed a huge amount of money to fight the war, so they go into the war 5 billion marks in debt and come out of it with a national debt of 156 billion marks. So E, their economy is a mess, and this new government doesn't have money to do the things that it's promising to do. Our next letter, and probably the most important problem Germany faced in this period, is I, international. The Treaty of Versailles makes Germans irate. Germany did not lose World War I or surrender. They signed an armistice agreement with Britain, America and France, agreeing to stop the fighting. Despite this, Germany was not asked for its opinion in the talks held to discuss the peace treaty drawn up at the Palace of Versailles, just outside of Paris. That treaty gave Germany the blame for starting World War I, when this clearly wasn't the case. World War I started over a small dispute between Serbia and Austria back in 1914. The Treaty of Versailles really punished Germany, mainly because of France and partly Britain pushing to punish Germany and ensure that they could never attack again. The first way they did this was by demanding that Germany pay reparations, a huge amount of money, to pay the cost for repairing the damage done by the war. This money went to Britain, France, America, and all the other countries who were the winners of World War I. The reparations payments were due to be made each year, and it absolutely crippled Germany's economy, and we'll come back to this later on what happened when they couldn't afford to pay. The next way they punished Germany was by taking away a huge amount of their territory or land. If you look at this map, all of the green bits were taken away from Germany in the Treaty of Versailles. This was extra annoying if you look at this map, because in 1917 Germany had almost won the war against Russia in the east and conquered a huge amount of new territory, and the Paris Peace Treaty at Versailles took all of that new territory off of them, as well as giving their land away to Poland, Lithuania, France, Belgium and Denmark. The final way the Treaty of Versailles punished Germany was by limiting their military, trying to ensure that Germany could never start a war again. So first of all, they were banned from having any tanks, they were banned from having an air force, and their huge army was limited to just 100,000 men, which was nowhere near enough to defend the entire country. On top of that, if you look at the map, the purple area to the west of Germany, the Rhineland, was demilitarized. That was the richest industrial area of Germany, and they weren't allowed any soldiers in that area to protect their own country. And we'll come back to this with our final point. Our next letter of Weimar is M, murders. There were over 300 politicians killed between 1918 and 1923. This is a huge problem because it makes Germans feel very, very unsafe. But millions of Germans were very unhappy about the new type of government. Many Germans wanted the old Kaiser back instead of democracy, and some Germans didn't want democracy, they wanted a more communist form of government. On top of this, there's a huge myth that comes out called the Dolchstoß, or the stab in the back, which was that these new democratic politicians had sold out Germany's army, that Germany's army had not been losing World War I, and that the politicians had surrendered Germany to the enemy. Partly as a result of this, there were armed gangs on the streets, particularly a group called the Freikorps. These were ex-soldiers who'd lost their jobs but still had their weapons and were very angry. It wasn't just any old politicians getting murdered. The finance minister and the foreign minister were both murdered in this period, and over 300 murders meant that Germany was unsafe, dangerous, and pretty scary place to be. This brings us on to our next letter of Weimar, A, armed rebellions. As well as individual murders going on, there were political groups that were armed and did not believe in democracy on both sides, on the left wing, the extreme socialist and communist side, and on the right wing, the extreme nationalist side. The first one of these armed rebellions we're going to talk about is the Spartacist, the left wing side, because it came first. The biggest party in the Reichstag was the SPD, the left wing Social Democratic Party. The first president of Weimar was a social democrat called Ebert, and the chancellor leading the coalition was an SPD chancellor. But because of proportional representation, they didn't have enough seats to form a strong government. The problem for the SPD is that they'd split with the more radical left-wing parties. The SPD had supported Germany's fight in World War I, and after the Kaiser had abdicated, Ebert had made a deal with the army to bring in a moderate democratic government to stop the more radical communist side. But because of this, many socialists left to form the Independent Socialist Party. They were inspired by what had happened in Russia, where the working classes had not only overthrown the king, but also overthrown all the rich factory owners and the old rich aristocracy who ran the army. The two big leaders of this movement were Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, who became very famous, and they claimed that the new democracy was just a trick to keep the workers out of power and to keep the old systems of power in place. But they also had support from the police chief in Berlin, and they nicknamed their group the Spartacist after the ancient Greek slave rebellion. Understandably nervous that the chief of police in the capital city didn't support the democratically elected government, the Socialist Party decided to have him removed. But the workers rushed to his defence all across Berlin, setting up armed barricades and forcing the government to retreat to the small town of Weimar, hence why the constitution was signed there and the republic became known as the Weimar Republic. This made the government look incredibly weak, especially to business owners and the old aristocracy who worried that democracy was just not strong enough to beat or stop a communist uprising. The Spartacist uprising was so huge there were even communists on top of the Brandenburg Gate, the main monument in the middle of Berlin, armed and waiting to defend their revolution. However, Ebert and the democratic government didn't give up. They called on the illegal Freikorps, who came to Berlin and defeated the communists in a matter of days. Spartacist leaders Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were both murdered by the Freikorps, so the rebellion was really easy put down, and you could argue it's not a huge problem. But the fact that the government had to rely on the illegal Freikorps to help them defend democracy showed that they really were pretty weak. Our next big rebellion is the right-wing Kapp Putsch in 1920. This started when the socialist government tried to comply with the Treaty of Versailles and reduce the number of men in the German army. Many in the army and the Freikorps were just not willing to let that happen, and General Luttwitz ordered the Freikorps to move into Berlin and this time themselves to force out the democratic government. This was much less dramatic than the Spartacist uprising. Many Berliners welcomed the Freikorps, there was little fighting, and a right-wing politician called Wolfgang Kapp was chosen to lead the new government. However, Ebert and the socialists refused to give up. They called on the workers all across Germany to rise up in a general strike, which completely paralysed the country. The new Kapp government couldn't operate and was forced to give up. So the democratic government again survived, and again the Kapp Putsch wasn't a big challenge because it didn't last long. But again, you could argue it was a big challenge because the government relied on someone else to protect them, in this case the striking workers. The Spartacist uprising and the Kapp Putsch made the government look weak to all Germans, so they're a big problem. But on the other hand, you could argue they're not such a big problem for many Germans because they only affect people living in Berlin, which is why it's important to note that although we use those as examples, there were uprisings all across Germany in different cities, in different regions throughout the period of 1918 to 1923. So it is chaos with armed groups trying to overthrow the government in different cities. The final important uprising we need to know about is the 1923 Munich Putsch. At this point, the Nazis were not a big, important party. They were not known all over Germany. They were a small party, mainly based in the city of Munich in Bavaria in southern Germany. And they would meet in beer halls where Hitler became famous locally, giving angry speeches about how he would like to destroy democracy. But in 1923, at the height of the Ruhr crisis, which we'll talk about next, Hitler called together his Nazis in one of the most famous of the city's beer halls and began to organise a plot to go into the centre of Munich the next day with weapons and overthrow the democratic government. Von Kahr, the leader of the Bavarian government, even came to the beer hall and agreed to join in, but he then left the Nazis to drink through the night planning their rebellion, which doesn't seem the best way to plan an uprising. Unfortunately for Hitler, Von Kahr then betrayed him, phoning the government in Berlin and letting them know what was going on. So the next morning, the Nazis were met by armed police and the Munich Putsch was fairly easily defeated again. It's another example of an armed rebellion against the government, but it's also really important because it puts Hitler on the map. Hitler was arrested and sent to prison, but he was given a very lenient sentence because the judge was quite sympathetic towards him. It also got his name known internationally and all across Germany, and being in prison gave Hitler time to write his book Mein Kampf, where he set out all his ideas about how he was going to destroy democracy. Our final letter of Weimar is R. The Ruhr invasion leads to hyperinflation. You'll remember the Treaty of Versailles had ordered Germany to pay billions of marks in reparations to the winners of World War I, particularly France and Belgium. You'll also remember the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany wasn't allowed troops in the Rhineland, one of its richest industrial areas on the borders with France. So the French sent their army to invade and take over the Ruhr, to take over Germany's mines and its factories, and to take what they were owed in material goods if they couldn't get it in money. This particularly angered Germans because many of the troops the French sent in were African colonial troops. Germany had felt like France was cheating by using African troops in World War I, and many right-wing racist Germans were horrified at the idea of black African soldiers being in control of part of German territory, as you can see from this newspaper. In response, the Germans decided to make the Ruhr a really difficult place for the French. The government ordered the workers of the Ruhr to go on strike and refused to cooperate with the French, refused to go to work, and refused to make the factories and the mines operate, so the French couldn't get what they wanted. This meant industrial output began to drop and there was less of the coal, steel and other goods that the French had invaded to take. To pay the workers who were on strike, the German government decided to print money. The problem with this was there weren't many goods to buy, so people with money were willing to pay more and more for the goods that were available. The more money the government printed, the more money people were willing to pay, and prices went through the roof. There was hyperinflation, like a balloon blowing up. Eventually the government printed 5 billion, 20 billion and even 100 billion mark notes. People needed whole wheelbarrows full of money just to afford one loaf of bread, and money became so worthless people began making dresses or children began playing with it for fun. This is really two separate problems. First of all, the French invasion made Germans feel weak, made them feel like other countries internationally were disrespecting them. On the other hand, it's also a huge economic problem, and this economic problem affected every single person in Germany. Business leaders thought the government was useless, it just couldn't control the economy. Workers didn't know what price things were, that kept changing by the hour, and many middle-class people completely lost their savings. Their savings were completely wiped out by this. On the other hand, you could argue that hyperinflation is not such a big issue, because although it gets really, really bad in 1923. In November 1923, a new politician becomes Chancellor, Gustav Stresemann, and he brings in a thing called the Rentenmark. And this new currency pops the bubble and stabilises Germany's currency, and actually hyperinflation is ended pretty quickly in 1923. So that's it, one simple word to help you remember the key events of the period. Weimar, W-E-I-M-A-R. Weimar voting system, the economy's in chaos, international Treaty of Versailles makes Germans irate, there's murders, there's armed rebellions, and the Ruhr crisis leads to hyperinflation. Now all you've got to do is decide which of these problems you think is the most important and why. I would strongly advise you to argue that the Treaty of Versailles is the biggest problem, because you can link the Treaty of Versailles to the economic problems, you can link it to the Ruhr crisis, you can link the anger that caused the armed rebellions to the Treaty of Versailles. Pretty much everything goes back to that Treaty of Versailles, and it's still a huge problem, the Treaty of Versailles, 10 years later when Hitler gets to power. But that's up to you. You can make your own arguments. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful day.